sooner or later. And I want to advise you that you have a duty to contest, because there is no substitute for you. I'm going to tell you a few things today which I hope you will remember for the rest of your lives. Please remember them, they'll be helpful. Getting into politics was one of the decisions I made which I was never quite sure was correct. I was heading the Department of Languages at what was then the Murutala College of Arts and Science in Benue, when our community wanted to build a secondary school in Otupa, where I come from. And I was involved in the arrangements. The school took off, it's doing very well today, and I went back to my job as a teacher. And then the elections approached in 1979, and the leaders of the community came to me and said, oh, come and contest the election. I said, no, no, no. I don't have the money, and I'm my mother's only son. I'm not going to take the risk. Because my mother had 3 boys, 2 died in childhood. I survived with 6 sisters. And my mother said to me, don't take the risk. They'll kill you. Because politics didn't become dirty today. It's always been untidy, always. They came thrice from the village. Every day, larger delegations came to tell me, you must contest. I said, there are other names. I gave them. Go meet them. Because as head of department, I was living in a 6-bedroom house. I was having fun. I was enjoying my teaching. And then they said, no, you must. When finally I decided to contest, I had to find the money to run the election. And it is not cheap. It wasn't cheap then. It's not cheap now. It will never be cheap. Well, I got into the business, and you can't believe it. Many of those who asked me to run and said to me, just go in, we'll support you, vanished. Couldn't see them anymore. But I had gone too deep. There was no pulling out. I was contesting against the principal of a school in my neighborhood, who was a much richer person and came from a much stronger family than mine. Well, we got into it. I can't tell you some of the strange things that happened in the course of my contest. And don't make any mistakes, this is Africa. Babalawos got involved, trying to knock you out. You saw very strange things, and make no mistakes, evil exists. We survived, won the election, got to the House of Assembly. I was supposed to be Speaker of the House because there were 3 major ethnic groups in Benue at the time, the Tiv, the Igala, and the Idoma. The Tiv man was Governor Aperaku, the Igala man a deputy, and an Idoma man was supposed to be the Speaker. We got to the House, it didn't work. And for 3 days, the House couldn't sit because I said, no, this is the arrangement we made in the caucus. But I was persuaded to leave it alone, and I decided to settle for my seat. They said, no, you must be Deputy Speaker. I said, no, I didn't come here for that. I'll be in the House. When I do my 4 years, I go back to my business. Anyway, pressure came, I became Deputy Speaker. And I was in the House, we tried to carry on with business, it went on for a while, then of course, a little crisis here and there once in a while. 1982 was when I left the House of Assembly to go to Lagos on the invitation of the president then. I was 34 years old. And of the 13 of us who were taken to go to Lagos at that time, I was the only minister of cabinet rank. The rest were junior ministers. I didn't lobby for it. I didn't even know Shagari. I had never met him. That's how it happened. Now let me then tell you, sometimes one disappointment, as they say, is a blessing. If I had been speaker, I wouldn't have gone to Lagos. So when you're disappointed, don't grumble too much. One lesson I want you to take. Sometimes something funny happens to you, you say, oh God, why me? If not you, why somebody else? So things do happen for reasons. Sometimes we don't know enough. Nobody reads the future. Something happens to you, it may hurt you, take it in stride, offer it to God, carry on with what you're doing. Got to Lagos, Ministry of Communications, election in '83, I was reappointed minister in charge of the steel industry, Ajaokuta, Alaja, and so on. Then on the 31st of December '83, the coup happened. I knew about the coup 2 days before. I tried to warn the president, couldn't reach him. Now, I commissioned the first post office in this town and the first telephone exchange in this town. Right? Then Abuja was a big bush, very big bush. After the coup, we were detained for 8 months, all locked up in Kirikiri prison. No trial. We were told to prove our innocence. And now please listen. I'm telling you these brief stories because this is what happens in politics. On October 2nd, 1984, they came to the prison one night. We were there with Alex Ekweme, Adamu Chiroma, Odumegwu Ojukwu, all of us were locked up. Ojukwu was not a minister. The soldiers locked him up because they were afraid he would cause trouble for them. So at 7 p.m. we were told we could go home, that they had found nothing against us. Odumegwu Ojukwu said he wasn't leaving the prison because he wasn't sure the soldiers were not thinking of killing him on the road from Kirikiri to town. The rest of us, Adamu Chiroma, myself, and one Binyamin Usman, got out and asked them, how do we go home from here? Oh, they said, well, there's no transport. You mean we should walk from here in this very dangerous place? Well, the only vehicle there is available is the Black Maria. Adamu Chiroma said, well, you've been using it to carry governors. Carry us home. We went. My wife and her brother had been waiting from 8 a.m. at a petrol station in Apapa, where the Black Maria dropped us. And then we gave Adamu Chiroma a lift, dropped him in his house. And then I went to Surulere to stay where my family was staying with my brother-in-law. That's how I graduated from Kirikiri prison. And on getting back home, no problem, I was just about 36 years old. I decided, well, I'll go into my farm business. And I started developing a cashew plantation. And then I started a poultry farm as well. And when I started planting the cashews, the villagers said, oh, look at him, useless man. After being minister, he has no money, he's coming to plant trees. And they said, how long will the trees be before they germinate? I laughed at them. The elite in particular were the ones making the jokes. The ordinary farmers who came to me and saw what I was doing asked me to give them seeds, and I gave them. And let me tell you, just last year, cashew farmers in my constituency made 150 million naira sales. I gave them seeds, some of which I brought from Brazil. And this last season, they made over 200 million. And this year, I've just returned from home to look for a piece of land where we're going to build a factory for roasting the cashews. Because raw cashews go from here to Vietnam, where we visited in October. So we have now decided that we'll roast the cashews here and make the money and create jobs. The biggest cashew exporter The biggest cashew exporter in Vietnam is a man who is just 52 years old. He employs 10,000 workers, makes $250 million a year, and a profit of 40%. He took us around his factories. But guess who did cashews first? A man called Dr. Michael Okpara in the First Republic. He planted cashews for two reasons. One for erosion control, and the other for cash. But since he died, nobody has added any new thing in the Southeast. He also planted 17,000 hectares of palm trees in the Southeast. At the time, Eastern Nigeria contributed 40% to the world's total consumption of palm oil. Today we are importing. Malaysia took the seeds from here in 1961. Today Malaysia exports palm oil to Nigeria. I thought that I'd have this conversation with you because one of the problems in this country is that there is too much a gap between the old and the young. There is need for us to talk. We older ones pretend that we know everything and that you young ones don't know anything. You young ones say, oh, they're old men, they're out of date. Yes, there is a lot you know we don't know. A whole lot you know we don't know. But there's also some stuff that old people know which will be useful to you as you grow up. Therefore, I want to congratulate Dr. Okorie for this effort he's making, and you must continue to drag older people here to converse with the young. Because you are the majority in this country, almost 60% of this population is below 45. The old will go, you will replace them, but it will be very dangerous to replace them without knowing a little bit of why the failures of the past have been happening. I will briefly mention a few things that happened here that have created problems that nobody can solve for the time being. Then I'll go to Agric, and then you can ask questions. One of them is that there have been too many coups in this country's history. I know we celebrate when there is a coup because we think the incoming government is going to make everything better. But if you read the excuses for every coup in this country, from 66 to the last coup, whatever it was, it's the same excuse. Corruption, nepotism, tribalism, lack of competence, blah, blah, blah. The same thing. Compare Nigeria to a country called India. India became independent in 1947, August. At that time, India encompassed Pakistan and Bangladesh. Then Pakistan broke away and Bangladesh broke away. There was a time between 1959 and 68 when India went through the worst hunger and poverty experience anybody has ever experienced in the world. Families used to move to the streets, die one by one, ambulances picked dead bodies to go and bury. There was a prime minister called Mr. Shastri who would beg Indians, whole families, don't eat for 2 days a week because there's not enough food to go around. He died mysteriously in his sleep. Some people thought he was poisoned. After him came Mrs. Gandhi. But you know what? There has never been a coup in India. Not once. Each time there is a dramatic and unconstitutional damage to the constitution of a country, there are more damages than you can imagine, especially to the economy. And it's the economy that's the biggest disease tormenting you young people today. You can't find jobs, you have ideas you want to create, you can't find money, you have nobody to talk to, and you just wonder what to do with your lives. Am I right or wrong? Now, what is even worse You can't go to a bank and borrow money. Now, imagine a young man or young girl who graduates and decides that, well, I can't find a job, let me do hairdressing. You need some nice space, paint it up, put your washers, dryers, put a small gen set, maybe a freezer where you're selling some coke while the women are doing the hair. You need about probably maybe 1 million naira, maybe $500,000. There is no place in this country today where you can walk in and say, look, this is my dream. Can I borrow this and set it up? Nobody will lend you the money. But if they have to, the interest rate is such that you can't pay. And anyway, you must have a security in a Asokoro or Maitama, which presumes that you're already a millionaire. If you were, why would you borrow? That has been the tragedy of Nigeria's economy for the last 35 years. Then they came here in 1986, asked us to devalue our currency. They tried it in 82. The Shagari government said no. And when he said no, Dr. Nnamdi Azikiwe and Chief Awolowo supported Shagari even though they were in the opposition. They said it was too dangerous to devalue the naira. In 84, they came again. This time, Ronald Reagan, President of the United States, sent a classmate to Muhammad Buhari, who was then head of state, one General Walters. He sat down with Buhari for 1 hour, tried to persuade him to devalue the naira. Buhari refused. Then in 86, they came, this time they assaulted the whole of Africa by what they called the Structural Adjustment Program. And then we began the most, and I have no apologies to any economist anywhere in the world, the most nonsensical and idiotic thing we ever did in our history. We began devaluing the naira every week by a process of auction. I was in Hong Kong with a friend when I phoned home and I was told that day in April that the devaluation had started. We auctioned the naira, 3 naira to $1. Before then, the naira was $1.50. And I said to him, this is the beginning of Nigeria's journey to disaster. One day, this thing will be 300 naira to $1. He said, no, you're exaggerating. We hit 520. Then they told us to practice free trade. Remember what I'm telling you. Among you, there are going to be governors, ministers, and senators. There are. And don't for any reason presume that you are in control of every situation here. You're not. There are forces out there that are interested in your remaining poor, so they can dominate you. And they also have active participants within the country who will defend what they're saying, even though it doesn't make sense. A country can devalue its currency if it's an exporter of commodities, so that your goods become cheaper. But when you are an importer of everything, from pencils to toothpicks to turbines, and you continue to devalue your currency, and you are told don't produce anything in your country, import from us. We don't even make pencils here. It's only the last 2 years we started making toothpicks. I'm telling you this. We import tomato paste, we import sugar, we import honey, we import salt, we import milk, we import orange juice, we import everything. Then they were telling you to keep importing and keep devaluing your currency. Which is why we're in this mess now. And which is why every regime that comes in will be popular for no longer than 2 years. Because people expect you to change this situation. The cancer is the economy. They deceived us into a corner. And it's very difficult for us to get out. Today the naira is so weak that if I need $1 million to set up a factory, I have to look for 360 million naira. 2 days ago, a friend of mine was here, he came to my house. He said, the interest rate is a disaster. If I borrow 2 billion naira today to build a hotel at 20%, every year I have to pay 400 million in interest. Meanwhile, in 1 year, I may not make 120 million. Bear this in mind, you upcoming leaders of this country. Be very careful about economic advice. Ask more questions before you accept what they tell you, because they put us in a trap. By 2050, this country's population will be 450 million. Number 3 after China and India. Can you imagine? Can you imagine the problems we'll be facing? Jobs, housing, water supply, sanitation, transportation, security, when there are no jobs. How do healthy young people like you survive in a country if you wake up, there is nothing to do? You have 2-3 degrees. You have the energy inside you. But you're like a car with a very sound engine, but no tires. You're sitting on bricks. So we've been battling this, and it's not everybody, unfortunately, in the political system who even understands the danger we're facing. You raise this issue, you may not get any support. Maybe because none of them has ever borrowed. I have borrowed, I've gotten in trouble with the banks and paid back, but it's not been easy. And I asked them, how do you think this country will survive with this kind of outrageous interest rate forced on us with the connivance of some of our own people who refuse to realize the danger we're falling into? Which is why Africa is in this mess. Which is why our children are now crossing the desert to go into slavery. I saw an auction recently on the internet. A young Nigerian was sold for $400. That's the price of a cow. They auctioned him and took him away. And yet, no country has the resources we have, beginning with the energy of you, the youth. That's one challenge you will face. Unless you sort out the economy, you can do very little. The other one is the destruction of the local government system. When I was chairman PDP, I quarreled with governors constantly. Why have you allowed the local governments to die? You don't give them their money. You go to your village, they can't even do a drainage. They can't do a gutter. They can't do a culvert. They can't repair a market. They can't repair a school. Where is the money? Having said all that, I'll come back to the issue of agriculture and say a few things to you as individuals. The way out of these things is for you, when you identify a goal in life, to fix your mind on it. The power of the mind is the greatest power on earth. Don't be fickle about it. I always knew I wanted to be a farmer. And when I started, I had no money. And I'll tell you the story of a young girl recently who came to my office. She wanted to plant palm trees. You have land? Yes. Where? Kogi State. What's your problem? I have no money for seedlings. I have no money to clear my land. I have no money, no money, no money. I've tried a few people. They tried to be funny with me. I refused. I said, fine. I'll find a bulldozer to clear your land for you. Send the bulldozer, cleared, I think, 10 hectares. And within 2 weeks, she planted. It's 2 years already. In another 2 years, she'll be harvesting palm trees, palm bunches, and making oil. But she said she had been focused on this matter for nearly 5 years. But she refused to give up. So don't give up. I'll tell you the story of Coca-Cola. Began in Delaware in the US in 1877, 1878, thereabouts. The man who started producing Coca-Cola in the first year sold only 12 gallons. 1 year of starting a business, 12 gallons. A gallon is 4 bottles. Don't you think he should have given up? He didn't. Today, they produce 8 billion bottles of Coca-Cola per annum. Per day, sir. after 12 gallons a year, he refused to give up. Then Henry Ford, the man who built the motor car, he made 28 attempts and failed. He tried so hard, wasn't eating well enough, his intestines went funny. They had to do an operation. Cut part of the smaller intestine to join. All his life he enjoyed no food better than hamburger. After the joining of the intestines, the doctor said, sorry, no more hamburger. Then on the 29th attempt, he succeeded. And the motor car came out. And he would watch his workers eating hamburger, but he couldn't eat. And he was very angry. But he had succeeded. But that was not his problem. Americans turned around and said, my God, the guy was a mass murderer. Why should he build a machine that travels at such a speed? Put families inside, they will crash and die. It was better for them to go in chariots drawn by horses, so there was no danger of falling and dying. That was then. He was demoralized for the first 2 years, couldn't sell cars. Today, everybody has a car almost. Then the two men who invented the aircraft, the Wright brothers, 1901, they were two rascals, really, bicycle repairers. And they got it into their heads that they could build a machine that flew. People thought they were sick. In Nigeria, they would have said they're Ogoni or witchcraft. Today, how many aircraft are flying? And how many people are operating airlines? People don't give up if they want their dreams to mature. You are going through tough